Hey, hello again. So, I wanted to talk on the third lecture of the lockdown series for Bangor University about how to communicate the design process. So, I thought this would be a nice, interesting build on basically that we've talked a lot about prototyping, its role in user research, but then it's about okay, you've done your project, how do you actually communicate not just the hero shot for the end, which is all the glory, but how do you actually communicate the process to prove that you did the best possible work to back up the ideas in the first place? And I guess the reason this is so important is that whilst you're still an unknown quantity, by definition, you haven't got pedigree, you haven't got reputation. And it's not to be a downer about it, it's just the simple fact that you need to show not necessarily a folio of 50 different products where you've worked for international companies and startups and all these sorts of things. It's being able to say instead, here's the quality of my thinking. And even though I've maybe only done two or three or maybe even 10 tops projects, then I have really, really good thinking. I understand how to empathize with the users. I understand how to extract good insights and so forth. So that's really why I'm saying it's important to show your design process. And the irony is, you might think, oh, and when you're a big deal, you'll never need to do it again. Sure, for some people, it might be that when you get into that artistic level, that is not a problem. But actually, if you take a field like medical device design, you still have to document your process really, really well. So if you want to be in one of those more stringent industries of the more engineering and technical specialities, then it's actually critical that you've already developed this skill. So it might, I want to get away from the idea that it's just window dressing and it's just putting your notes in order. It's actually a professional technique to get good at. So I hope I can give a few sources of inspiration and also demystify some of the points and give a few pointers as how to get some good examples. But again, I got to stress, as always, I am just one source. Please look at as many of us as possible, because if you absolutely hate my style, that's fine. Make it your own. That's the thing that matters. So at the end of the day, you got to do you. But to the best of my knowledge, I'm going to show you how I did me, and I hope some of it's useful. So here we go. So, lockdown lecture 3, how to communicate a design process. So I thought I'd talk about awards, as I might as well, because I won a good amount of them in my final year. Now, you might be thinking, oh, was I well connected and all these sorts of things, but actually it wasn't the case. And so I'm going to get into that. That basically, this final year project, I think the reason it stood out was because it's unlikely for someone usually who works at an art school to basically do something that is very, very technical with the NHS. And yet, of course, now I think it's actually a lot of where product design is going, is how to really get into user-centered research. And I think, dare I say it, if you wanted to sort of consider beyond that, even considering global and sustainability centered design, I think would be an evolution. If I were to go back in time, I think I would probably even expand this further. Anyway, back to the point. Why did I win all these awards? I had no prior awards. I had average grades. I really don't actually have a genius IQ. No shocks to a lot of people, but I just wanted to say that as a point. I didn't feel very confident. Don't judge me now on 10 years of having developed skills to be able to present. I was really cripplingly nervous at the time. Would feel almost sick, giving presentations some days. I didn't have any sort of big, powerful connections, so my family weren't pulling any strings for me to get me jobs. I wasn't famous. I'm not rich. I'm not posh. I had a good but not amazing CV. Even though I'd previously done a degree, I mean, a 2-1's fine, but I only just scraped it, to be perfectly honest. And the idea wasn't perfect. In fact, if we want to get into it, I'm happy to do some Q&A, but it wasn't actually particularly commercially viable in the end, it turned out. So the idea wouldn't really change the entire world. It would have impact for some people who are at a high risk of mortality from this failure. But really, it's not curing cancer. Let's just be real about that. And also, I didn't know the judges. It's not one of those in-group things. So I think the reason you win awards in hindsight, and I stress this is in hindsight, it's easier to do that way. But I think some of it was about a good idea, good communication, and I think a little bit, I hate to admit it, but a little bit of awareness of the game. And I was lucky that I had a couple of mentors from senior students who had graduated who told me a little bit, just, it really is important to show your process. And so I can't stress this enough, that this was the secret bit of advice that ultimately, and I've been a judge at Dyson, I always look for process. If I can't judge on raw merit, you know, that I know exactly what I'm talking about and I know how to judge this, I'm going to judge the process and then still reevaluate the strength of the end concept. I can't say that this is, speaking for Dyson as a whole, but that's certainly my process as someone who was asked to judge one of the rounds in the UK. So 5 tips, but I'd say these are my 5 tips. At your liberty to make them your own in any way you want. So giving people reasons to believe. So a well-documented process is a good reason to believe in someone's authenticity and that they've done good work. So again, you may not know anything about hacking prosthetics, but this example of just using Instructables and creating a guide, it's fair to say it's thorough. Of course there are better photographers out there, but it's well lit. You can see a natural sequence. I haven't left big gulfs between the steps so you think, hang on, I've got no idea what's going on. It's worth saying there was text with these as well, which I've included in the guide. And again, just showing how to use tools step by step by step. So again, I think even for simple processes, I think it can be hard for someone else to follow who isn't you. Maybe doesn't have your background, doesn't have your skills, and indeed the familiarity with the product itself. So I often still enter into little Instructables contests just because also it gives me a deadline. It stops me procrastinating, I should add. But I think it's a really good way of just keeping my skills sharp to make sure that I stay fresh. And also I learn so much from that community about how to present good ideas. And if you haven't seen Instructables, it's all process. I mean, the whole point is instruct you how to do something. So the best in class is the best in class at doing that thing. So, stats and independent expert input. So essentially the notion of, if you don't believe me, go ask these people. So again, a big life fix. This is me speaking to, absolute experts in prosthetics and orthotics, I think it's called, which is basically attachments and things that stick on your hand if you're needing assistance. And they were basically validating my work by, engaging with this and critiquing it. And similarly, it's not to say that everyone can produce a peer-reviewed journal article, and actually I didn't. This was someone I worked with, but I was a contributing member of that publication. So again, that sort of credibility that your test isn't just some stats and a little Excel graph, it's actually something that's been approved by a bigger body. And again, I'm sure if I was in the position of my tutors, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time scrutinizing it if I knew that the Journal of Association of Anesthetics had already reviewed it. You'd just be like, wow, it must be good. So I think, and again, I was very upfront. I did not do all that work, but I worked with quality people. So I think having experts who are excited about what you're doing in your project really just pays dividends. And I think being generous up front, it does pay back. It does come good. So clear problem or agenda and solution. So is doing something worthwhile in the first place. So I think, if you haven't sort of figured out the pattern, quite often you basically say, here's the problem, and I've got a nice ugly picture of a ruptured trachea versus a healthy one. Obviously this is from an autopsy, so it's pretty grisly. But again, it really brings it home. It makes it emotional that, look, this could be your trachea if this thing fails. Interestingly, I said 100 people, approximately at the time, died from this every year. And indeed, to that point that I made earlier about it not being viable, in the grand scheme of things, it's tragic to say it, but actually that sort of mortality associated with a device is kind of very background noise when you're dealing with the huge volumes of people that go under the knife. So it was one of those things that I just wasn't ready for as a student, but I think it actually helped me understand the importance of really knowing not just whether my problem was good, because all the doctors and all the clinicians loved it, but actually the people who are involved in making the product, they still got to make a return on it. Now, ethically, you might find that repugnant, in which case, yeah, the medical device industry probably isn't for you. But I think whatever industry you work in where you are trying to ultimately make money from doing something, even if laudable, there is always that equation somewhere in the background, if not the foreground. So the solution, again, coming back to that, trying to visualize it clearly, what's going on with as little text as possible. Looking back, definitely could have done with a lot less text. It needed to be like, this pops up so your throat doesn't explode. Is probably, the level that I should have been going for. So being more sort of punchy before, after visuals. I mean, in many ways, Twitter wasn't that big back then, but now I feel like Twitter for me is a really, really good example of how to compress information to the essentials. There are, of course, pros and cons with that, but we can get into that later. So, number 4, I showed failures and learnings, not just the wins. And I think the key thing above anything is really the learnings. Anyone who wants to look at your work is interested in, what did you learn? Did you go from basically someone who didn't know much about something to someone who knew a lot? And in that journey, you went through all sorts of obstacles and adventures, and it's good fun. So, here I am sort of basically, you can tell from the body language that this is like this is not working, with Ruby and Ross. And it was a bit of a tough call. But interestingly, it inspired Ross and me got together and figured out something. And then that led to the big payoff. And so I think, it's that narrative of saying, you can just say, oh, look, we got here. Or you can say, we tried this, it didn't work, but actually, had we never done that, we wouldn't have learned something that made us do this. And I think that's the sort of arc you need to get adept at communicating, because quite often that is just the truth of the design process. A lot of it is red herrings and wrong turns. So a good, simple story, or basically, would you tell someone down the pub, or as I said, could you tweet it? So the hero's journey, Google this if you haven't, and I mean really do it. So, if I look at my final year project, I took a picture of all the various products, and I did this sort of slightly unusual thing. I put the dates along the bottom, but I then sort of almost gave an approximate scale of whether things were going well or bad. So relative. I mean, it's not an exact scale. If I had enough page, I would have put this one all the way up here, obviously. But what's interesting is it shows that basically there was a lot of ups and downs. And if you've Googled the hero's journey, this is basically about saying how you go through a big journey to do something, but ultimately the journey is the most interesting thing, because you come out changed from doing it. And so an easy pop example is Lord of the Rings. Frodo goes to chuck the ring in said volcano. If he just did that flying on the back of an eagle with some rocket launchers, it would be over pretty quick and it wouldn't be that exciting. So it's really about his journey of friendship and camaraderie and all that sort of stuff, and how he evolves as a young man into a much more mature, responsible person, whilst also taking a lot of kicks along the way. So I think it's not that you have to be fictional as in non-factual about your product, but giving it a bit of pace and dynamic is ultimately just how humans interact with things at an emotive level. So you can pretend that it doesn't exist, or you can realize that it does, pretty much everywhere you look. And once you start understanding the hero's journey, you see it everywhere. You see it in adverts, you see it in books, you see it in films, even in radio plays. So check it out. Basically, this is sort of, all the complex emotive stuff. And then if we look at basically that thing of Frodo getting on an eagle with rocket launchers, job done, people just think it's easy. And so they think you had no setbacks, there was no learning, there was no challenge, not going to give you benefit of the doubt if you didn't show it. So essentially, you might be thinking, but I'm a designer, I'm not a marketeer, why have I got to do all this extra work? And I think, well, consider this. If you've ever bought a product, then, did you ever have an emotional attachment to the way that sort of thing was communicated? And would you ever buy something that you didn't truly understand? And if you ever sold a product, would you ever sell it with no enthusiasm, or that it didn't have a market that was worth selling to? So in either case, would you mention that socially? So if you wouldn't do either of those things, then I think critique yourself on whether your product your proposed design has something similar. So I wanted to give a couple of examples just to try and give some substantiation to this. So I thought a nice project might be, going for a rehearsal of a pub chat. So if you create a fictitious pub story, and I think the key thing is to sort of imagine that they're not two designers being nerdy. It's that this is a stranger. And I know this is a couple of steps, but imagine you've got a stranger who's going to tell the project of your story to another friend. So again, they can't be designers, they can't use jargon, they just have to explain it simply. And so it might be that they end up sort of having this discussion of like, oh, I saw this, guy with the curly hair, and he was doing this thing for this lad who wanted to be a hairdresser, and I don't quite know how he got to it, but it was something to do with a beard trimmer. But ultimately, he got two combs together, and he did this clever thing, and da 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 da. And so, if you can basically get to the end of the punchline in simple, Yorkshire accent optional, then you're kind of aware that it has a very simple narrative to it. And so I think it'd be a really good example to try. Just, can you even do that? It's sort of play acting. And ask yourself, what are the memorable aspects of the word? As I said, even when I was doing it, I was self-censoring, going, oh, there was something about a beard trimmer. I don't really remember what it was. I mean, even be a little bit self-critical of some of the bits that you think are maybe a bit waffly or a bit complex. Imagine what someone like that would just be like, I don't know, but the point was this. He went to Poundland and he got two combs and it worked. So I think there's merit in going through this, and I think also you could even apply a level of saying, imagine if they're slightly drunk, average intelligence, and certainly, as I said, non-designer, and reflect on the sort of the factual parts, the emotions, and the flow of information. Does it feel realistic that someone would say it? So, they would not begin with, I saw this designer, his name was Jude Pullen. He had studied in this university and done this and done this. He began the process by blah, blah, blah. So the point is, it has to be genuine. Would someone really rattle through this down the pub? And so you can even write it out. And I don't know if anyone's a fan of XKCD, but he basically does a good job of Stickman, and he uses these little leading lines to basically imply the narrative of the conversation. So if you can get your sort of project to feel and flow like that, I think you're doing really well. So the hero's journey, as I mentioned, if you plot out all the stages of your project, consider the highs, the lows, the pacing, the fast and the slow. There's a really nice one of Kurt Vonnegut. I'll put a link in below, of the shapes of stories. And so he sort of like draws all these different curves and says, look, this is the Cinderella curve. This is the, whatever, hero's journey, all that sort of stuff. But it gives you a bit of basis to see how this sort of is actually quite pleasing, to be not too short, not too long, not too over dramatic, but not too boring either. So I think what's interesting is if you then basically add some pictures to this, you could put together 20 slides, and every 20 seconds you talk about each slide. And then what you've actually ended up doing is creating something, a format called Pechakucha. And that is a Japanese style of presenting, or at least it originated in Japan. Sorry, I should clarify. And basically this, 20 slides, 20 seconds each, takes you to about 7 minutes. And it's a really nice format. And I've actually used this at companies like Lego with really nice response, essentially how effective it is to cut to the chase. And also that it brings people together because there's a focus on what you're saying rather than you like squinting to read the slide or looking over your shoulder and just reading and not engaging with the audience. So again, it's a really, really strong technique, and I'd urge anyone to take a look at pechakucha.com. So I think it's one of those things where if you can master that before you enter a workplace, you're going to fly through critiques, product reviews, presentations. It's a tremendous technique. Even if you adjust it and do break the format, it's an incredible format to have tried to actually get good at. And I have said that having actually done some Pechakucha talks. So again, I mentioned Twitter earlier on, and I thought it might be fun as a project to do the, I guess what I'm calling the Twitter test. So let's say that your awesome project has just been picked up by Core 77, BBC, Fastco, Kickstarter, or whoever you want to choose. But it's worth noting that each of those companies have a different house style and narrative of how they frame things. But either way, compose a tweet, and you've got to include the link, which will of course take up some space. You've got to include 1 to 4 images, depending on whether you want to hero shot it. And also bear in mind, the image will also do that letterbox thing. So think about what you can see before you click on it, which is a really hard art to master with Twitter if you're not used to it. And then at least 3 hashtags, which then is going to use up some of your 140. So what you're probably going to be left with is 100 characters to explain your project. And you might think, yeah, I can do it. But really, try doing it and see if it makes sense. I'd say get together in a group of 3 or 5, compare the tweets, critique each other to see which is most effective, because you're going to learn something by who did what. And again, what I like about this is it's digital. You can just share it on a Zoom call or email it round or whatever you want. But either way, I think it would just be, it's going to take you 5 minutes, but it could be quite an intense 5 minutes to see if you can actually do it. So consider writing the article as well. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, you're going to click through to the article, but then, that's my point, is that no one's saying your project has to operate only at a Twitter level. The point of Twitter is to help connect people to other ideas that are usually in a longer format, be it video or be it an Instructables guide, a Medium article, or whatever. But just understanding how to play that game between hooking someone's attention and then giving them the full download, that is just basically business life. So the pitch, you probably heard about elevator pitches. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, as it's obviously pretty fair to say that, but I'd say a subtlety is just to apply what I've just mentioned in Twitter, pitch, and the hero's journey, and think about how you pace things with that 30 seconds. So I think it's worth getting into that thing of, you know the long version, the short version, the memorable bits, all that sort of stuff. And I think, you can see that the trick is about how you recount what you think matters, and put yourself in their shoes and frame it to think, what will get their attention the most. So this is notoriously hard, I should add, but be patient and keep going. And I think practice with people who aren't designers is another really good point just to add quickly. So how these help, trying to break it down a little bit. The pub chat, I really do think this is going to sort of help get the memorable highlights of the story clear. And I think the hero's journey is really about showing the lows, and it makes the wins more heroic. So if I haven't been clear, that thing of saying, if you got from there to there, it looks kind of interesting. But if you went from there and then realized it was that big a problem and then achieved, then what you'd call the delta, the gap, is really big, so it feels really dramatic when it's all gone wrong. And you see that in stories. And sometimes it's people can think, I just want to present the good win, but it's not actually interesting. And as I said, it actually does the opposite for your credibility, ironically. So again, Pecha really good way to get away from text and details, and also it forces you to be able to not memorize a script, but just understand how to react to the audience. And I think there's a lot of stuff out there on Pecha, but basically it's all about trying to use the slides as a visual, just so you can navigate your way and remember the plot, as it were. But ultimately you're watching the audience and reacting. So even if you're having to do this in isolation, I would still say doing it on a Zoom call is totally legit, because you're still watching people's faces to see whether they look bored or whether they're confused or whether they're really engaged and finding it fun to watch. So again, Twitter, get your point across real fast. Elevator pitch, I think, is basically preparation for awards and businesses, because if you're able to do it at speed, people are just incredibly relieved that you got to the point that fast. So one of the things I'm sort of wasn't as in two minds to mention this, but I think all of this is all very well to say those 5 tips, and I think they're fine, and I stand by them. But the strongly recommended thing, which is not a short thing, this is like 3.5 hour documentary, which is not for the faint-hearted, and it's not even the length that's the problem. The problem is that I find when I watch this, it kind of basically begins to sort of pull apart your entire perception of the world. And I'd say there's not many things where I'd want to exaggerate and say that, that, because it sounds very dramatic, but I really haven't met many people who've watched this and not been similarly affected. So if you're going through a bit of a tough time, I would say this is not one for you. Find a moment when you're feeling positive, or at least looking for a bit of intellectual challenge. But it's very intense, but incredibly worthwhile. It's probably one of the most influential documentaries I've ever watched, and it basically goes through what you'd call the history of modern marketing. And in case you didn't know, Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And obviously, Sigmund Freud was looking at a lot of basically sort of techniques about how to understand the human conditions, our emotions, the ego, all these sorts of things. And ultimately, his I'm trying to phrase this delicately, but there isn't a good way. That basically his nephew took all of those techniques that understand our psychology and then used them to figure out how to sell products to people at a level which I think it would be fair to say it's just manipulating people. And you might think, oh, I understand marketing. I'm not manipulated. But this article, this documentary, polemic, I should say, is so relentless in its examples, which you just had absolutely no idea about. I mean, one that always comes to mind for me is that, and I can't show clips because I don't want to breach copyright. But there's one about the suffragettes movement and how until then most women and most men thought women who smoked, it's kind of horrible, and no one would do that. It's a man's thing. It's disgusting and it's stinky, and it is. Let's be honest. Even before all the cancer news, it was just sort of horrible and stinky. And yet, so Bernays basically worked with the early suffragettes movement, and he sold it to them to say, when you light up a cigarette, as we go down this like big parade, from the Royal Parade, as a very political thing that was going to be filmed, you should light up a cigarette and you should smoke it publicly with good sort of flamboyance as well whilst you do it. And you should mention that this is a torch of freedom. So the lit cigarette being a torch of freedom. And of course, this was pushing against the sort of, the idea that, women can't smoke because it's a man's thing. And of course, he had timed it perfectly at the beginnings of that sort of, you can say the seeds of the sexual revolution that was to come later. And so basically, the reason, like, maybe women would have inevitably smoked anyway, we don't know. But he was instrumental in making that happen. And so it's quite chilling. And then there's some slightly more upbeat, fun examples that, speaking as a British person, bacon and eggs and the fried breakfast, you always think as a bit of a sort of institutional, it's a British thing, right? And you go, no, it wasn't actually. It was a challenge from the Danish government, who, in case you didn't know, huge producers of pork, wanted to basically think, how can we get people to eat more pork products? And essentially, he invented bacon and eggs as a breakfast. Until then, all sorts of other things were eaten for breakfast. There was no fried English breakfast. And so people, if you're not intrigued by this, basically this is 3.5 hours of someone deconstructing everything that you thought was, normal and taken for granted, and saying, no, there are puppet masters who've engineered and created all of this from scratch. And so it leaves you questioning a lot about your own autonomy of choices and your should we say free will. But I think it's absolutely tremendous. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. And I think if you're going into a profession like design, you do actually have to own a little bit of the responsibility that what you ultimately produce might be a virtuous product, but there's a good chance that you'll be working with people who are asking, yes, but can we sell more of these to people? And so I think it does mean that in an age when we really are trying to reflect on consumerism, overconsumption, resource scarcity, sustainability, all of these issues, I think this documentary couldn't be more relevant to what you're doing. So again, I think challenge yourself. It's definitely going to be more impactful than a box set, I suspect. So anyway, getting back to slightly lighter stuff. And of course, you. So, your folio, CV, and applications. I'm not going to go through this blow by blow, as I already published, I think, a reasonably comprehensive section on this on a 2018 lecture called Push the Button, again at Bangor University. And I essentially went through a little bit of a formula, you might say, as to how to sort of run through things to do with, the cover page, contents, how to create basically something around a big impact. And again, this I'll just touch on it quickly. The point about if you wanted to show big process, going through the problem, the jeopardy, which is the hero's journey part, all the way through to the win, you probably only need to do this really well once, because then it becomes reasonably implied that you can do depth in your user research. So you can clip along at a bit better pace with the other project. And that's how I think you sort of end up at this, recommended 10 slides. And I really wouldn't go over that unless you've got a very, very good rapport with the person who's interviewing you and they've specifically asked for more information. And again, going into this, I broke it down into you're explaining the real problem, not just the problem that's in your head. Have you got data? Can you substantiate it? Design, build, test. Again, do it in real life with real people, or as I said, by proxy with real people, and iterating on that to make sure you truly understand it. If not, going back and changing things. Again, always looks great if you can show that you had that humility and guts to do that. And if the user genuinely loves it, I also just put, flippant comment about, yes, now you can do the CAD and do your hero shot. But I think that's a good format. And if you're not familiar with how to put that together, I think I also tried to expand a little bit on, sort of how to write a good cover letter and also sort of a good approach towards companies as well. So I just wanted a quick closing note on brevity, which I haven't done on that last thing about the century itself. But essentially, I was saying that good communication is not about a lack of information. I don't want you to sort of hack out all the good bits. But with the Twitter example, I'm saying that essentially, if you know how to boil it down to its essence, then essentially you're aware of what you deliberately left out and what was critical to leave in. So I think from after that, it means that someone's compelled to click through to the longer read. And I think it's the same with elevator pitches, business plans, budgets. I used to ask my team at Sugru, because it was how I got impressed in me at Dyson, to try and write everything in a project proposal on one side of A4. Now, you're allowed as much appendices as you want, but it has to explain itself on one side of A4 in normal point font size. And I think, again, this thing about sort of hacking down the project, you understand the key points, which means that you can basically build everything on top of that, or go down to the basics very, very easily. But you truly know what is the key point that is driving your project from the start. And it means it has a better headline, it has a better strap line, it works on Twitter. It means that if a company or a news publication does pick up your story, it's easy for them to understand. And again, you'll probably keep hearing this phrase of "don't make me think." It's cited a lot of a reality of striving for brevity. So have a go at some of those examples. I really hope they're useful. And please post any questions and comments below. I'd love to hear back. And I really hope this is useful. Thanks ever so much. Take care.